A cattle baron's twin sons begged the stranger to stay and be their mother. The axe handle split on the third swing. I stood there looking at the two halves in my hands, the head buried in the block, the grain of the hickory gone gray and dry as old bone, and I thought, that's about right. That's about where everything is. A man holds on to something past its time and it doesn't break clean. It just gives way in the middle and leaves him standing there with nothing to show for the effort. I was 43 years old. I owned 11,000 acres of the best grazing land in the Texas Hill Country, 1,200 head of cattle, a stone house my father had built with hired Mexican labor and his own 2 hands, and I had not slept more than 4 hours running in 11 months. Not since Clara died. I set the pieces of the handle on the chopping block and went inside to find another axe. The boys were at the kitchen table. Daniel and David, 7 years old, identical right down to the gap in their front teeth, the one thing that had always made me smile without trying. They were eating cornmeal mush that Lupe had left for them, and they were not talking to each other, which was wrong. Those two talked constantly. They talked in their sleep. They had a whole language between them that I only half understood, little words they'd made up before they could speak real ones. But that morning they were just eating, spoons going around the bowls, and the quiet in that kitchen had a weight to it. David looked up at me. He had Clara's eyes, that particular shade of brown that goes amber in the right light. "Papa," he said, "are we going to have to go live with Aunt Helen?" I've been asked worse things, not many but some. "No," I said, "you're not going anywhere. Lupe says she can't keep coming." "Lupe's right, I'll sort something out." I found the other axe in the lean-to and went back out and split wood until my arms were good and tired and my mind had gone quiet. That's the only prescription I knew that worked. Wear the body out enough and the thoughts stop for a while. You buy yourself maybe 2 hours of plain animal sleep. What I was thinking about before I wore it out was how a ranch runs on systems, and most of those systems run themselves if you set them up right. The hands know their work, the cattle know the land, the seasons know what they're doing, but a house doesn't run on systems. A house runs on a person who cares about it, and I didn't have one of those anymore. Lupe Garza had been coming 3 mornings a week from town, 4 miles each direction on a mule she was too old to be riding. She cooked what she could, washed what needed washing, kept the boys from going entirely feral. But her own daughter had just had a baby, and she'd told me last Tuesday, quietly and with genuine sadness, that she'd be stopping at the end of the month. I understood. I told her I was grateful for every morning she'd given me, and I meant it. My foreman, Cole Briggs, had offered his wife twice. I'd said no twice. A man doesn't pull another man's family into his mess. That's a line. My sister Helen, who lived in San Antonio, had written 3 letters suggesting I send the boys to her while I got things settled. I'd read all 3 letters and set them face down on the desk and not answered any of them. The boys were not going to San Antonio. The boys were going to grow up on this land and know what it was and be ready for it when it came to them. That was the thing I had left to give them, and I was not going to fail at it. But I was also failing at it somewhat. I knew that. A man can know 2 contradictory things at once. It was the last week of October when the buckboard came up the main road. I was at the corral with a Greenbroke filly, just working her on the rope, nothing fancy, getting her used to the idea of a human being at the other end of something, when I heard the wagon. The road from Fredericksburg ran along the east side of my property before it cut south toward the river, and it wasn't unusual to see travelers on it, families moving west mostly, the occasional supply wagon, sometimes drovers pushing a small herd to somebody else's land. This one was different. It was a single woman driving, which was unusual but not unheard of. She had a canvas-covered wagon bed, not a proper Conestoga, more like a farm wagon someone had rigged a cover onto, and a bay horse that was favoring its left foreleg. Not badly, but clearly. She wasn't going fast anyway. She was barely moving when she pulled off the road onto my drive. I watched her do it. She sat there at the edge of my property for a moment like she was thinking it through, and then she clucked the horse forward and came up toward the house. I handed the filly's lead to one of the hands and walked over. She was perhaps 30, dark hair, pinned up but coming loose, a gray dress that had been better days ago, a face that was, I don't know exactly how to say this, a face that had been through something but hadn't let it win. There's a particular quality in a person who's been knocked down and gotten back up one too many times and decided to stop being surprised by it. She had that. "Your horse is lame," I said. "I know," she said. "Stone bruise, I think, or maybe a wrap that's been on too long. I'd be obliged if I could water it and rest it for an hour." She looked at me straight. "I'll pay for the hay." "You don't need to pay for hay." I walked around to the horse's left side and ran my hand down the foreleg to the hoof. She let me do it without asking, which told me something. A woman alone doesn't let a strange man near her stock without reading him first. The shoe was loose and there was heat in the hoof. Not catastrophic, but enough to matter over miles. "Shoe's working loose," I said. "Where are you headed?" "South," she said. "River country. I have a cousin down near Uvalde." "You're about 40 miles short of Uvalde, and your horse won't make it today, even if you shod her this afternoon. Ground's been hard since September." She took that in without any visible reaction, just absorbed it like information. "Is there a farrier in town?" "There is, but it's 4 miles back and the road's rough and you'd be laming that horse worse going in. I've got a man here can shoe her. Costs you nothing but the afternoon." She looked at me for a long moment. "Why?" I appreciated the directness. "Because it's the right thing to do," I said. "And because my boys will be home from school in 2 hours. And this is the most interesting thing that's happened on this ranch in 3 weeks." Something shifted in her face, not quite a smile, but close. "I'm obliged," she said. "Elias Holt," I said. "Ruth Connolly," she said. That was the beginning of it, though I didn't know it was the beginning of anything. I thought it was an afternoon. Her name had been Connolly since she married a man named James Connolly in Missouri 6 years before. He died of typhoid fever 14 months ago in a settlement camp outside of Abilene. She told me this later that afternoon, not as tragedy but as plain fact, the way people talk about things they've had time to make peace with, or at least time to stop bleeding from. She'd been working as a seamstress in Abilene since then, she said, and doing well enough. But the winters up there were a thing she couldn't seem to get past, and her cousin Margaret in Uvalde had written saying there was work for a woman who could sew, so she'd decided to come south. She said all of this matter-of-factly, at the kitchen table, while Lupe stood at the stove listening with her back, turned in the way women do when they're paying close attention but being polite about it. The boys came home at 4. I heard them before I saw them, Daniel first, his voice carrying from the road, already in the middle of some story, and then David's quieter answers, and then the door banging open and both of them stopping in the kitchen doorway. They stared at Ruth. She looked back at them. "Well," Daniel said. Ruth almost smiled. "Well, yourself." "Who are you?" David asked. "A stranger whose horse needed fixing," I said. "Mind your manners." "I'm Ruth," she said. She was looking at the two of them with an expression I couldn't quite read. Careful, maybe. The way someone looks at something they want to be certain of before they name what it is. "You look alike," she said. "Everyone says that," Daniel said, annoyed. "I imagined so." "Can you tell us apart?" David asked. It was a test. They gave everyone this test. She studied them for a moment, seriously the way she did most things. Then she pointed. "You've got a small scar above your left eyebrow. Him, none. Beyond that I'd need more time." David touched his eyebrow, surprised. The scar was from a fall off the fence 2 years ago, and it was barely visible. Most adults never noticed it. "She got it," Daniel said to his brother, not without admiration. That was the moment. I didn't know it was a moment at the time. I thought it was just a thing that happened. Ruth helped Lupe with supper. She didn't ask. She just stood up and started doing it, moving around the kitchen with the ease of someone who's fed people in small spaces for most of her life. Lupe watched her for a minute and then stepped aside and let her take the biscuits, and by the time I came in from the barn, they were talking quietly in the way women will when they're assessing each other and finding it acceptable. We ate. The boys told Ruth about their school, about a fistfight that had happened on the road the week before, about a horned toad Daniel had caught and kept in a jar until it died. Ruth asked questions. Real ones, not the kind adults ask children to be polite, actual questions, like she wanted to know the answers. What did the horned toad eat? Had Daniel tried crickets? Could he catch another one now that it was cold? I watched my sons talk to this woman and felt something that I am not sure I have a good word for. It was somewhere between relief and grief, and I don't mean that dramatically. I mean it the way a man means it when he's been carrying something heavy for a long time, and someone briefly lifts part of it, and he realizes how heavy it's been. After supper, she stood up and began clearing. I told her to leave it. I don't mind, she said. You're a guest. She looked at me directly. I've been clearing tables most of my life, Mr. Holt. It's not a hardship. I let her clear. There's no good argument against someone who's right. Her horse was shod by 5 o'clock, and my man Hector said the hoof needed another day's rest regardless. I told her she was welcome to sleep in the spare room, that it was nothing and we had the space. She looked at the window. It was already going dark and the temperature was dropping, and said she was grateful. That was the first night. She slept in Clara's old sewing room, which I had not gone into since February. In the morning, I heard her up before me, heard the stove door and then the smell of coffee, and I lay there for a moment in the dark trying to remember when I had last woken to that smell with someone else making it. I got up and she had already made biscuits and had a pan of bacon going, and the coffee was ready. You didn't have to do this, I said. I know it. I poured coffee. She was looking out the east window at the light coming up on the hills, her hands wrapped around her own cup, and there was something in the stillness of her that was restful. That's the only word. Some people create stillness around them. Clara had had that too, though it was a different kind. Clara's was warm and slightly merry, a contained brightness, but Ruth's had its own quality, more weathered. Like a stone that's been in a creek a long time and gone perfectly smooth. I'll ride out after breakfast, she said. Your horse could use another half day. She thought about that. Stay for dinner, I said. Hector can look at the hoof again mid-morning. If it's right, you leave after. She didn't answer right away. Then, all right. The boys came down and found her there, and David smiled, a real smile. The kind that takes over his whole face the way Clara's used to, and said good morning like he'd been practicing it, very formally, which made Daniel laugh. Those were my boys. That was my house. I tell you this because I want you to understand what it was like before, so you understand what it was like when there was even a hint of something different in it. I did not ask her to stay beyond that second morning. I want to make that clear. What happened was not me asking. I was in the east pasture that afternoon when Cole came riding out to find me. He didn't look alarmed, but he had that look he gets when something's happened he thinks I should know. The stranger woman, he said. Mrs. Connolly. She's been working in your house all morning. He paused. Lupe showed up. I think she wanted to see who was here, and the two of them have been going at it. Laundry, the whole back porch. I didn't say anything. And the boys are home already. Somebody at the school sent them home. Teacher's sick. They're out back with Mrs. Connolly and Lupe. I rode back to the house. The scene in the backyard was this. 2 lines of washing strung between the cottonwoods, Lupe feeding sheets through and Ruth pulling them straight, and the boys running under the wet laundry like it was some kind of game, and the sound of them, it stopped me for a second. The sound. They were laughing. The running undersheets game was apparently very funny, and both of them were at full volume about it. Ruth saw me, and there was a moment where I thought she might apologize or explain herself. She didn't. She just looked at me steady and went back to pulling a sheet straight. I got down from the horse and went to help. Lupe gave me a significant look. I ignored it. We didn't talk much that afternoon. We worked, there was plenty of it, and Ruth moved through my house with an ease that should have been strange and wasn't. She knew where things were by then. She knew the boys' rhythms, which was the more important thing. She knew that Daniel needed to be left alone when he went quiet, and David needed the opposite, needed someone to stay near and talk gentle, and I don't know how she knew that in 2 days, but she did. That evening after supper, and after the boys were in bed, she sat at the kitchen table with a piece of needlework she'd gotten from her wagon, and I sat across from her with the ranch ledger open, and we were there for 2 hours in the lamplight, and neither of us said much, and neither of us was uncomfortable about that. It was the most at peace I had felt in 11 months. I closed the ledger and said, "Mrs. Connolly, I'd like to make you an offer." She looked up. "I need someone to run this house. Manage the kitchen, look after the boys when I'm in the field, keep things from falling apart at the seams. I can pay a fair wage, and you'd have your own room and full board and whatever time you needed for your own work." She looked at me for a long moment without expression. "I know it's not what you were heading toward," I said. "I know you had a plan." "I did," she said. "But your horse is barely right, and the road to Uvalde is hard, and the cousin you're going to. You said yourself you haven't seen her in 4 years. You don't know what you're going toward." "No," she said, "I don't." "You do know what this is. You've seen it 2 days." She set the needlework in her lap and looked at the lamp for a moment. I waited. I had learned not to fill silence. "What do the boys know?" she said. "About the offer, nothing. I haven't said anything to them." "And you tell them what? That I'm hired help?" I thought about that. I'd tell them the truth, that you're staying on to help, that they should treat you with respect and listen to you when I'm not here. What it becomes beyond that, I don't know. I don't know you well enough to know, and you don't know me. She was quiet. "I'd expect you to leave the moment you wanted to," I said. "No contract, no obligation. You want to go to Uvalde in the spring, you go. But right now in October, this ranch needs what you can give it, and you need a place to land." She picked up the needlework again, looked at it, set it down. "I'll try it," she said. "A month." "A month," I agreed. She stayed 6. I'm not going to pretend those 6 months were simple. A woman moving into a household that's been without one for nearly a year, with 2 7-year-old boys who'd been quietly desperate for something they hadn't had words for, and a man who'd built walls practical as fence posts, because the grief had been sharp enough that he'd decided the smart thing was to feel it less. That is not a simple thing, and it had its moments. The first hard one came at 3 weeks. David woke up screaming from a nightmare. He had them sometimes, had been having them since Clara died, and I was on the far side of the house, and before I could get there Ruth was already in the doorway of his room. I stopped in the hall. She sat on the edge of his bed, and she didn't say much. She put her hand on the back of his neck the way you do with a frightened animal, firm and steady, and she said, "I'm here, I'm right here," and she said it until he went quiet. I stood in the hall in the dark, and I will admit to you that I had to put my hand on the wall, not because of anything soft, because of what I had not been able to give him those nights. I'd been there every time, sitting on the edge of that same bed, and I'd said the right things and held his shoulder and stayed until he slept, but I couldn't give him what she had just given him in 2 minutes, and I knew it, and I knew why. I was his father, and I was grieving too, and children feel that. They feel a grieving father even when he's holding them, and there is nothing to be done about it except keep showing up and hope it's enough, and sometimes it isn't enough, and that is one of the harder things I have ever sat with. I went back to my room. In the morning, she and I were at the stove at the same time, and I said, "He have a bad one." "Settled fast," she said. "He's all right." "Thank you." She handed me the coffee pot. "He's a good boy." Both of them are. They're the best thing I ever had a hand in. She looked at me then, one of those direct looks she had that went somewhere most people's didn't, and said, "You're a good father. I want you to know I can see that." It was nothing. It was 3 sentences. But I'm telling you that it landed somewhere it needed to land, in a man who had been wondering for 11 months whether he was failing at the most important thing he'd ever been given. I didn't say anything. I poured the coffee. My hands were steady. The second hard thing came in December. Her cousin Margaret wrote. I didn't see the letter. It was addressed to Ruth, and I'm not in the habit of reading other people's mail, but I knew something was in it from the way Ruth was at supper, more careful than usual, quieter. The boys didn't notice. I did. After they were in bed, I came to the kitchen, and she was at the table with the letter in front of her. "Bad news," I said. "No, Margaret's found a good position for me, seamstress for a merchant family in Uvalde, room and board included." She smoothed the letter with her thumb. "She's been holding it. She thought I'd be coming in November." I sat down. "You'd be a fool not to take it," I said. That was the honest thing, so I said it. "I know that. Guaranteed work, guaranteed roof, closer to family." "I know all of that." She looked at me. "I told you a month and it's been 3. You don't owe me anything past what you agreed to." "I know I don't." She folded the letter. "I'm not leaving, Mr. Holt. I just wanted you to know the offer exists and I'm not taking it." I didn't ask her why. It wasn't my place and I knew enough to know it. I nodded. She went to bed. I sat at that table for a while after. What I was thinking about was this. I had built something here that I had not planned to build, and I did not know entirely what it was, but I knew what it wasn't, which is to say it wasn't employer and employee. It wasn't quite a family, but it was shaped like one. And the thought of watching her load her wagon and drive south, that thought was a clear, cold thing, like putting your hand in creek water in January. I didn't want it. But I also knew that I was a man with 11,000 acres, and a cattle operation, and 2 growing boys, and the ghost of a dead wife in every room of the house, and that I could offer Ruth Connolly a life of hard work and uncertain comfort, and the kind of beauty that is nothing but the land and the sky and the people you're in it with. And I didn't know if that was something a woman wanted or something a man just tells himself a woman wants. So I sat with it and I said nothing. In January, the boys figured out what they felt. I am still not entirely sure how it came up. I was in the barn doing books. I had an old desk out there, warmer than the house in the deep cold, and I heard the boys come in from the back. They didn't see me at first. I heard Daniel say something about Ruth, and then David, and then Daniel again, their voices going back and forth in the way they did when they were arguing something out. Then David said, quiet and very clear, "I want her to stay. I want her to be," and then he stopped. Daniel said, "Be what?" Long pause. "You know," David said. "Yeah," Daniel said, then, "Me too." They were quiet for a while. I could hear them moving hay around with their boots. "She might not want to," Daniel said. "How do you know?" "She might have her own things." She turned down Margaret. "How do you know that?" "I heard Papa telling Cole." Silence. "We could ask her," David said. "You can't just ask someone that." "Why not?" "Papa says you should ask plain when you want something." I stayed where I was, did not move. "Then you ask her," Daniel said. "Me." "You're better at it." A long silence, then the sound of both of them moving toward the house. I sat there with the account book open on my knees and the lamp burning, and I thought, all right then, all right. I didn't do anything with that for 2 weeks. I want you to know that. I am not a man who acts on things immediately. I think about them, I turn them over, I look at every face of a thing before I make a move. It has cost me some opportunities in my life and saved me from some disasters. On balance, it is who I am. What I thought about those 2 weeks was whether I was feeling what I thought I was feeling because it was real or because I had been alone and sad for a year, and Ruth Connolly was a good woman who ran my house with quiet competence and my sons adored her. Those are different things. The first one matters. The second one will make you do things you regret. But I kept coming back to a simple fact. I had spent 11 months not sleeping, not tasting my food, not watching the hills change color in the evening the way I used to. And for the past 3 months I had been sleeping. I had noticed a meal. Last week I had stopped on the South Ridge coming back from the herd and looked at the light going out on the hills and felt it. That particular feeling that means you are still here. You are still in the world. The world is still worth being in. She had done that, not by doing anything in particular, just by being the person she was, steady in my house, good to my boys, asking nothing of me I didn't have to give. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, quite a lot. It was a Sunday in February, cold and clear, the first real cold snap of the season. The boys had gone with Cole's family to a church social in town. Lupe had arranged it, which is to say she had arranged everything as usual while pretending she was arranging nothing. Ruth and I were alone at the ranch for the first time since she'd come. She was at the kitchen table with her needlework when I came in from the morning rounds. I poured coffee. I sat down across from her. She didn't look up. "Mrs. Connolly," I said. "Ruth," she said, which she'd been telling me for 2 months. "Ruth," I put the cup down, "I want to say something to you." Now she looked up. "I have watched you in this house for 4 months. I have watched you with my sons. I have watched you when things went wrong and when things went well, and I know something about a person after 4 months if I've been paying attention. And I've been paying attention." She was still. "You're the best person I have had in my life since Clara died. And you're a different best, you're your own thing, you're not her, and I'm not saying that like she was more. I'm saying you have your own," I stopped, looked for the right word, "your own particular worth, that I have not been grateful enough for out loud." She set the needlework down. "I'd like to ask you to stay," I said, "not as hired help, permanently. I'd like to offer you," I stopped again because the word I was about to say was large and I wanted to get there the right way. "I'm asking if you'd be willing to become part of this. This ranch, these boys, my life. As my wife, if you'd have it." The room was quiet, the stove ticked. She looked at me for a long time. "I have learned to wait." "You mean that as plain as it sounds," she said. "I don't know another way to mean things. You've known me 4 months. I have, and I know enough. What if I stay and it's wrong? What if I'm not what they need? What if I'm not what you need? I've spent 4 months watching and I don't think that's the risk," I said. "The risk is you leaving. That's the risk I'm thinking about." She looked down at the table. Her hands were in her lap. I said, "I know what I'm offering isn't simple. I'm not a young man. I'm not easy. This land is hard and the winters are real and there are 2 boys who will grow up to be men and need things I might not know how to give them. I know all that. I'm not pretending it's other than it is." "I know it isn't easy," she said quietly. "I've been living it for 4 months." "I know you have." She was quiet for a moment, then she said, "Your boys, do they?" "They want it," I said. "I know they want it. They haven't said it to me, but I heard them talking in January. I wouldn't be asking if I thought they didn't." Something happened in her face. It was not something dramatic. It was the opposite of dramatic. It was the kind of thing that happens in a face when a person has been holding something carefully for a long time and decides to stop holding it. A settling. A coming to rest. "Yes," she said. "Just that." I nodded. I didn't say anything for a moment because I wasn't sure my voice would be entirely steady, and I preferred to have it steady. "All right," I said. She picked her needlework back up. Her hands were not quite still, I noticed that. "I'd like you to know something," she said without looking up. "I turned down Margaret in December because I already knew. I didn't say anything because it wasn't mine to say, but I knew." I sat with that. "I'm glad you stayed," I said. "So am I." The boys came home at 4 o'clock in a state of high excitement about something at the social involving a pie contest and an apparent disagreement over the judging, and they came through the door talking over each other, and then they both stopped at the same time because Ruth and I were at the table together, and something in the room had changed, and children feel things before they can name them. David looked at Ruth. He had that searching, careful look he got when he was reading a situation. Ruth looked back at him. She had one of her almost smiles. "Well," David said. "Well yourself," she said. And then Daniel looked at me, and I gave him one nod, and he grabbed his brother's arm, and the two of them let out a sound that I can only describe as a coordinated explosion of 7-year-old joy, and Ruth stood up from the table, and both boys ran into her, and she held them, one on each side, her arms around their shoulders, and the three of them made quite a picture there in the late afternoon light coming through the kitchen window. I looked at that picture for a while. I had been a man who owned 11,000 acres and 1,200 head, and a stone house that had been going quiet and cold. I was still all of those things, but there was this now too, and it was worth more than the sum of the other things by a measure I didn't have a name for. We married in March on the ranch, with the hills just turning green and the air still cold enough in the mornings to see your breath. Cole and his wife were there, and Lupe, and a few of the neighboring ranchers who had come to matter to me over the years. The preacher from Fredericksburg, who had come out twice already, once for Clara, and once before that when Daniel broke his arm badly and I had been afraid, drove out and spoke good plain words. Ruth wore a blue dress she'd made herself, a dark blue the color of late sky, with white at the collar. She had her hair up, and there was one piece of it that had come loose, just one, by her left ear, and I noticed it the way I notice things that are nearly perfect. She stood beside me in front of everybody, and she did not fidget or look away. She looked at me straight and said what she meant, and I said what I meant, and the boys stood together behind us close enough that they were touching, which is what they did when they were feeling things. After, when the others had drifted toward the tables Lupe had set up, Ruth and I stood for a moment at the edge of the yard looking south at the hills. Her hand was in mine. Neither of us said anything. The hills were green. The cattle were moving on the far south pasture, small dark shapes slow and steady. The sky was that particular Texas blue you only get in March, clear enough you could see forever. I thought about the axe handle that had split in October. I thought about standing at the chopping block with two useless pieces of hickory and thinking, that's about where everything is. Things break, you find what's needed and you start again. You do not do it alone if you don't have to. She squeezed my hand once, not for any particular reason, just because we were there, both of us, looking at the same hills. That was all, that was enough. David found me that evening after supper. The guests had gone, the boys should have been in bed, and he came and stood beside me on the porch where I was having a last smoke in the cold. He stood there for a while without talking, which is the David way. Then he said, "Papa." "Yeah. Are you happy?" I looked at him in the dark. 7 years old, Clara's eyes, that small scar above the eyebrow. "Yes," I said. He thought about that. Then he nodded, satisfied, and went inside. I stood there a while longer on the porch. The stars were out fully, the way they get out here away from town, not just the bright ones but all of them, the whole field of them going back and back. The horses were settled in the barn. The cattle were on the south pasture. The house behind me was warm and lit, and Ruth was in it and my boys were in it. I had been a man standing in a yard with a broken axe handle thinking that was about right. That was about where everything was. A man can be wrong about where he is. I finished the smoke and knocked the ash out on the porch rail and went inside.